As I said at the beginning with Olivia, it is wonderful to be here. And it came to me that as just sitting there are a couple of words I want to say to you at the beginning, which is well done. Well done for your love. Well done for your faith. Well done for praying. And well done for persevering, which is such an important Christian quality. And take that to heart and be encouraged by it today. I also want to say congratulations as well. Particularly congratulations in finding, through God's help, a new leader and his wife in Tom and Mim. And I think it's just marvelous, that they're here to lead you and to shepherd and pastor, etc., you as you go into your future. And I think a round of applause would be more than... I thought if you ever needed help in finding a new vicar, I had a sort of patent method, which was one of these chain letters, okay? And it goes like this, and this is, I thought, when I was leaving. He said, parcel up your vicar into a parcel and post him to a parish at the top of the list in this chain letter. And having done that, and having waited, you'll receive 1,167 clergy, one of which should be all right. Don't break this chain. One parish did, and they got their old vicar back, which is not what you want. So, yeah, it is great. It is great to be here and to be with Tom and Mim and all of you. I want to say just a word more about kind of the last 7 years as far as we're concerned, because we just gave you a few sort of snippets at the beginning. And yes, the family has grown. I've done various things. I've kept writing books, and so I've published nearly 6 books since I saw you last, over the last 7 years. And there are 2 of them here, by the way. One is on St. Luke's Gospel, which actually came out when I was here in the parish, but I've almost completed the foursome now in all the Gospels, and John will be coming out shortly. And then this other one, which is a slightly more light-hearted one about all the travel and stuff that I've done over the years, really since childhood, which I think is interesting, at least I think is interesting. And you might find it interesting as well if you like that kind of, if you like, Olivia says it's interesting and she's read it, so there we are. But what else? I just want to say that during lockdown, Olivia and I were sitting together in our kitchen in our house, lovely house in sort of countryside. And like everybody else, we were going online for services. And invariably, most Sundays, not every Sunday, but most Sundays, we would tune in to the service that was broadcast from here, the sanctuary service, week by week, faithfully, through that whole period of lockdown. You will never know, really, the extent to which it was a blessing and encouragement to very many people who you didn't see or didn't know about, but who were listening in. So I pay credit to the team here, and especially to Gary, who's sitting there, for doing that, because it wasn't easy, and yet it was a great encouragement. Me, in my own part, I did my bit of broadcasting from my little study, or big study, I should say, in the house that we live in, and was able to do, I think, like 3 series of talks, to the camera in the computer, my laptop, and that was a whole new experience for me, and I really enjoyed doing it. Now, when I left here, I thought I was relatively fit, okay, but I had a hip operation, but in fact, over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been in the inside of a number of hospitals. Actually, as I said earlier, it was quite an interesting experience, almost enjoyable, actually, experience, I would say. So I was inside Basingstoke Hospital quite briefly for a replacement. It's all about replacement and repair, really. And then I was in Reading just before Christmas 18 months ago for about 8 or 9 days. And then I went to St. Bart's in October of last year and had what they call open heart surgery for a valve. And I learned a lot of things during that time. And these are my top tips if you go into hospital, which I hope you don't, but if you end up there. My first tip is don't think too much about yourself. Second, it's to pray. Thirdly, it's to tell the staff what an important job they're doing. And that was as much for the cleaner, the person who came and cleaned the floors, as it was for the surgeon who had the extraordinary thing of opening you up and doing everything. And to say, you're doing a hugely important job here, and I really appreciate it, and what you're doing is so important. I found that was my sort of general line with everybody. Actually, they quite liked me by the end, have a patient around who said that kind of thing. And the other thing, because sort of being a chap who was writing stuff, I gave him a booklet. I said, if you're interested in the Christian life, I've written this little booklet here, and you can read it. And so I gave it to a few patients and a few members of staff, and I'll give one to you for free. And they're at the back there. And there are not many, I don't think we sort of stopped writing these kind of things, short things, which explain simply what the Christian life's about. That it needn't be a whole big mystery, that there is actually quite a simple way in, albeit profound. So there we are. Those are my top tips, should you ever be there, and generally for life as well. So then, let's come to Zacchaeus now. In this wonderful story in Luke chapter 19. I want to notice a few things as we begin, and then the first thing is that Jesus was on the move, that he was, if you have the text open to you, it's page 994, he was entering Jericho, which is that famous city down around the Dead Sea area, and we're told he was passing through. He was not going to be staying there very long because, in fact, in the middle or the end of this chapter, chapter 19, we find that Jesus is in Jerusalem and that he is now beginning the final and last week of his life, the passion narrative, which we'll be thinking about in just a few days or in a week's time. So he's passing through Jericho before he's going up to Jerusalem. And just before we get fully into the story itself, I want to take you to the last verse, which is verse 10, or I'm going to read from verse 9. This is Jesus' summary of what happens after his meeting with Zacchaeus. He says about it, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." And then he goes on to say, as a sort of final summary sentence about this whole episode, for the Son of Man, of course, that's Jesus himself, came to seek and to save what was lost. I don't even know about this, but of all the Gospels, St. Luke's Gospel is the Gospel in which the idea of being lost is to be found more than any of the others. It's a kind of favorite phrase of Luke, and you find it in his gospel cropping up in a number of different places. For instance, in Luke 15, which I know that you looked at not so long ago, when we have the parable of the lost son, the parable of the lost coin and the lost sheep. It's all about someone who has been lost being found. Zacchaeus, who we come to here, is a person who has been lost and is in the process of being found by Jesus. And then last of all, one of the other characters in the gospel who comes right at the very end is the dying thief. And I love that conversation between Jesus as he dies on the cross and the dying thief who's next to him. And he says, doesn't he, Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingly power." And Jesus says to him, "Well, today you will be with me in paradise." It's kind of the final picture almost in the gospel of someone who had absolutely nothing to offer and was dying himself on the cross, who was utterly lost, being found, even in the extremis of death, both Jesus dying and the thief next door to him. Now, it's not much fun being lost, is it? You probably don't get lost very often now because you have so many sat-navs and other things, devices that you use in your car. But I remember as a child being lost fairly vividly still. I was about, I think, 9 or 10. We were living in France at the time. We went to a very big museum. I got separated from my parents, and I didn't know where they were. I didn't speak very good French, and all I could see was pictures all around me. Anyhow, I needn't have worried, because they were seeking to see where I was, and eventually I was found. But it's not much fun being lost. And Zacchaeus, of course, as we'll come to in a moment, was a lost person, but there are people all around us who are lost. That is, they don't have a direction in which to go. They don't really know where they are at the moment. And Jesus says at the end of this wonderful short episode in Luke 19 about himself, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. One person who died quite recently and whose obituary I read in the paper, I'm always reading obituaries, by the way, in the paper I almost turned to them first of all, and she was a very well-known actress, British actress. And earlier in her life, she wrote this, and I wrote it down because I was so struck by it. She said, "I'd acquired everything I wanted, yet I was totally miserable. I thought it was very peculiar that I had acquired everything I had wanted as a child, wealth, fame, and accomplishment in my career. I had beautiful children and a lifestyle that seemed terrific, yet I was totally and miserably unhappy." Well, of course, it's sad. So it's not a question of, feeling lost when you don't have anything. She, rather like Zacchaeus, had a whole lot of stuff. But she too expresses this idea of being lost or miserable even. So then let's come to Zacchaeus now in the remaining part of my talk. That was just the introduction. And as usual, I have 3 things to say. Okay, some things don't change. Whee! And they're very simple, very profound, very true. And they're things you'll be able to remember and tell people in the street tomorrow when you're in Tesco's. What did the vicar say? That old boy who came back. I heard he was in town. Okay. And what you'll say, the first thing is this, that Zacchaeus was short. Not like my sermon. Zacchaeus was short. So let's read from verse 1, chapter 19. Jesus entered Jericho, as we've heard, and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Well, the fact that Zacchaeus was short was the dynamic in the story, because he couldn't see over the crowd, because he was too little. I don't know what size he was, but maybe he was just over 5 foot. I have no idea. Anyhow, he couldn't see over the crowd, so he could see a tree down the way, and he ran down the street where Jesus was coming. He went up into the tree, and there he waited in amongst what was really a fig tree rather than a sycamore tree. Now, I don't know to what extent his stature, i.e. a short man, was a driver in his life. The psychiatrists would have a bit to say about this, wouldn't they? And they'd say, well, he was very, very short, so he needed to compensate because of that. And so he was rude and nasty to other people as a result. I don't know that necessarily there is that connection, but you might want to think about it. Nevertheless, he ran ahead and he went up a tree in order to see Jesus. He was short in stature. Secondly, this is not the second point, this is the second sub-point of the first point. I don't want to raise your hopes too much. Yeah. He was short of friends. He was short of friends. I don't think he had any. Now, I love listening to the news. The BBC News, I hasten to say, on the radio and also on the TV. I listen to it at 7 a.m., at 8 a.m., at 1 p.m., at 5 p.m., and at 10 p.m. So if you want to know anything about the news this day, I can tell you. And Olivia says, I wish you wouldn't listen to the news so much. Anyhow, I do, and she'll vouch for that. And I particularly enjoy Sarah Montague, who does the 1 o'clock news. And I think she's a very compassionate and interesting person, and she presents news at 1. And one day when I was listening, as usual, to the news, she said, we're going to have at the end of the program some person who's done a lot of research on what makes people happy. And I thought, well, he's done all that research. I'm just going to say under my breath what I think make people happy. So I said that to myself, and I listened to what this American who'd done all this research came up with. And he said, whether you're rich or poor, whatever you are, what makes a person happy, pause, is good relationships. And that's exactly what I'd said to myself. So I felt very smug, and I thought, we're on the same page here. But it's absolutely true. And as far as I can tell, Zacchaeus had thoroughly bad relationships with everybody. He was short of friends. After all, he was the chief tax collector. Now, if you go to a dinner party and, people say, what do you do? Perhaps that's not the right thing to say, but people say maybe, what do you do, rather than where you come from. And you say you're a clergyman, and people don't quite know what to say next. But if you say, I'm a tax collector, that's my job, then almost certainly, probably most people think, oh, gosh, what did I do last year, my tax return, and so on. He was the chief tax collector, but more than that, he was extortionate. He took money where he shouldn't have taken money. He took money from people who were very poor. And worst of all, as far as the Jews were concerned, he was working for an occupying power called the Romans. Rather like, say, in France in 1940, working for the Nazi so-called government there and taking money off the French people. And he hadn't got any friends. And lastly, the third point to the first point, he was short of hope. Short of hope. I imagine there was something stirring, do you not think, in Zacchaeus? I mean, he'd heard about Jesus going around Palestine and Israel and Nazareth and Galilee and so on. And he'd heard the amazing things that he'd done, and there was something stirring in his life. And he thought, well, above all, what I want at least to see him. So I'll run along down the street. I'll say, I'll go up that tree, and at least I would have, seen what sort of guy he was as he passed by, because he was going through. Because his life, I imagine, was fairly hopeless. He got all the money in the bank, but he didn't have any satisfaction in his heart. And so he was a short man, point one, okay? We're done with that. Two, and here we come to the most profound thing in many ways about the whole story, is that he was a marked man. He was a marked man. Yes, certainly disliked by the crowd, but far more importantly, he was marked by God himself. And this takes us into that kind of the divine nature of the whole story. It takes us into the amazing plans and power of the Godhead, of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. It takes us into the kind of interaction between the divine and the human, which we see here. So it's explained just in wonderfully simple terms. When Jesus reached the spot, he stopped, obviously. He looked up, and he said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. I want to pause, as I often do in reading scripture, on particular words as we go through and say, I want you to notice these words. I want you to notice immediately. I want you to notice that unusual phrase, I must stay at your house today. And that final one I've just mentioned, today. You see, there was to be this great offer of new hope and new life for Zacchaeus, but there's something that he must do. And it's a very physical thing, a thing that he had to do bodily. He had to come down out of the tree. come down out of the tree, go back to his house, wherever that was nearby, and welcome Jesus into his house because he was going to have a meal with him, possibly even stay the night. We're not told about the detail of that. And there is a kind of spiritual parable, actually, in coming down the tree, because I think an awful lot of people need to come down from a tree, a metaphorical or a spiritual tree, in order to make the connection with Jesus himself. Maybe someone, I'm not necessarily here, but someone outside the church needs to come down out of the tree of suspicion about the church and what it's seeking to do, and about God. Or maybe it's to come down from a tree which is so prevalent today all around the sort of Western society, which is of scientific materialism. As I say, we've got an explanation for everything. We'll find it in science. We'll find it in what we know, and that will be enough. And if some people who we know and are household names in this department are ever to find Christ, then they have to come down the tree of scientific materialism and say, I'm going to humble myself before you. Or it may be that someone says, or they need to come down from a tree which is of their own guilt or shame. No, God will never have anything to do with me. He doesn't really know all that's gone on in my life and what's been done to me or what I've done to other people. But Jesus says, I've come into the world exactly for you, because I come to seek and to save those people who consider themselves lost. So come down, says Jesus, immediately. Now is the moment. This is a kairos moment. And I'm going to come to your house, and life's never going to be the same again. And I imagine at some point, maybe even that day, you know how it is in St. John's Gospel, you study St. John's Gospel, he says, Jesus only does what his Father shows him to do. You probably know that. You're all very well taught here, I know. You know that. And I imagine maybe in a conversation with his Father at the beginning of the day, he said, well, look here, you're going to go down this street, you're going to see this fig tree, and there's going to be a man up there, his name is Zacchaeus. And you're to say to him, this is the moment. And that's why Jesus says, I must. The must comes from the Father's will for this event. Come down immediately. A number of years ago, well, it's in fact a year or two before I left, I took the 8 o'clock service here, which we used to have, but very sensibly merged it with the 9 o'clock one now. And I was taking the service, and normally there were about 10 people. And I noticed that in the front row there was a man who I'd never seen before, ever. And what was extraordinary was that he was in the front row. Because no one who rarely or ever comes to church sits in the front row for the first time. And so at the end of the service, it's a straightforward Anglican communion service, short talk. I said to him, we haven't seen you over here before, what brought you here? And he said, well, there are a couple of reasons why I'm here today. Firstly is that I've got cancer and I'm being treated. We said, that's not the main thing. The main thing is that my son is an alcoholic. And his life is currently being destroyed. And he was in his 40s, this son. I said, I'm very sorry, can I come round to your house? He lived in a nice flat not very far away from here. He was a retired businessman. And I went round and I began to explain to him kind of what he kind of knew, which was what faith in Christ was about. Well, I think a few weeks later, he had gone to his Portugal home, second home over there, and he wrote me a letter. And he put it in this way. I don't often get letters from people like that. And he said, this was the first occasion I was able to confess my sins in a meaningful way. This was after I had gone to visit him. He did it on his own. I'm also learning to pray and converse with Jesus, who seems to have given me a greater sense of peace. I'm beginning to feel that he has the future and well-being of myself and my loved ones in his hand. Well, in fact, he died. I took his funeral service, but I was able to say with real confidence, following that letter and those exchanges, that salvation had also come to his house as well. And that's what it's all about, really. And Zacchaeus was a marked man. God had put his finger on him, and he responded. Now, the last thing I want to say, the third thing, is that he became, very soon, a transformed man. And the transformation was in exactly that area of his life where he had been completely weak and indeed corrupt before. That corruption and that weakness for making money had led to the distortion and no doubt to misery for countless people who had nothing but had to pay the tax. And then suddenly we find after Jesus had been into his house, in verse 8, but Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Lord, look, or look, Lord, I should say, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. You know, it's staggering. Such a huge reversal. And I can only think that that moment of receiving Christ and welcoming him gladly into his own home, as it were, engineered within him a sort of explosion of grace, which you can't really understand. It reminds me of something that a French philosopher, Blaise Pascal, wrote about his life. He was a great inventor, and he said, on one night, on the 23rd of November, 1654, I had a life-changing experience of God. He revealed himself to me between the hours of 10 and 12:30. I tried to write down this encounter on a piece of paper, expressing it in these terms: joy, 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 tears of joy, and other things besides. Zacchaeus must have had just a sudden release inside of him so that he could go and do this extraordinary thing. And I'm sure there was a run on the bank in Jericho, and Credit Jericho was going down the tube until the authorities got to know of it. He was transformed. And Olivia and I, because we read the weekly news that you put out and kindly send through us on email each week, read it, and you know, we are astonished at your generosity. Your generosity to a family who needed housing in Weston to provide it for them so they had a place to live securely. Your generosity to Malawi over so many years now, and again they face another cyclone, and your generosity to them. Your generosity to the Rock Project, and the desire to make this church, this building, kind of fit for purpose for future generations, for people who will follow on from us, as well as for ourselves and our families and young ones. Your generosity is great. And the explosion of grace in your own lives produces that kind of generosity to others, which is not to be found in many other places. I don't mean churches, I mean outside the church. So Zacchaeus was transformed, and I imagined that from then on he did have many friends, not just because he gave money away, but because people liked being in his company, because he was more than just the chief tax collector, and maybe he got rid of the job anyhow and did something completely different. We don't know, do we? So then, in conclusion, he was a short man, he was a marked man, and he was a transformed man. And I hope that we know the reality of those last two things, that God's hand is upon us, that we are marked by him. And that we are undergoing that transformation, which is lifelong in our own lives and in mine. I conclude with some words from Paul in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 18, which are such wonderful words. We all with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, and we are being transformed into the image of his Son from one degree of glory to another. That is our path. That is our calling. And that's what God's grace continues to do in our lives. Amen.